Aloha once again, friends and family. Let us pick up at vibratory levels. One of your scientists, a Dr. Hawkins, devised a vibratory scale that is rather crude but somewhat useful, and we will use that scale to make our point here. Dr. Hawkins uses a calibration scale that is roughly equivalent to the composite vibratory state of a soul multiplied by 100. The composite vibratory state of a soul is defined as a soul's average state of consciousness over a specified interval of time. For example, if a soul's composite vibratory state is midway between third and fourth densities, that soul would have a Hawkins calibration number of 350. You can delineate the state of consciousness and vibratory state of the physical body as a separate calibration number. Generally speaking, the physical body lags behind the overall composite level of consciousness by a full density. Therefore, a soul with a level of 350 in consciousness would have roughly a 250 level within the physical form. Those souls whose inner calibration level is above a certain point automatically enter a protective field of energy generated by the God Self and high density groups involved in implementing the divine dispensation. At this time, there are approximately 16 million souls on your planet vibrating at or above the level needed for ascension, which is 450 in consciousness and 350 in physicality. And let us remember this book was written in 2008, so that's much higher by now. Keep in mind, beloved creators, that this is not a pecking order or device with which to feel more or less worthy. All of God's creations are worthy. Everyone on your planet deserves God's love. There are no souls unworthy of being saved. Anyway, this is not about being saved. This is about ascension, something we will detail in chapter 5. This is also about being granted access to the stargates and portals necessary to lift the veils of earth and assist humanity in breaking free of the effects of the Luciferian rebellion, which we shall discuss in a moment, and Orion Draco interference schemes. Also, the Hawkins scale is not foolproof. Methods used to test the vibratory level of souls are often flawed, and accurate readings are difficult to determine by most humans. Although your vibratory state is important during the transition on Earth, it is ultimately meaningless because you are and always have been 100% of God. Those souls with pure minds and hearts that have put away judgment and comparison are being allowed to access the sacred DNA keys and codes and enter the stargates and portals necessary to break free of the veils of illusion on your planet. Any soul who sincerely desires to be free can and will be free. This is divine law. How do you access this state of perfection? Ask and ye shall receive. This truth is as valid today as it was in the time of Jesus. Whatever you desire deeply and fully with your whole being must come to pass. However, There are certain safeguards built into the ethers and astral regions of your planet that were necessary in order to respect the free will of souls evolving on your world. Therefore, if you ask for something that violates the free will of others' souls, it will be withheld by your own God self and guides. We will have more to say on this later, but let us get on with your history. The Luciferian Rebellion, Orion Invasion. The Luciferian Rebellion is discussed at length in some of your religious writings, including a highly distorted book called Urantia that was brought to Earth by the councils of Andromeda. The information contained in that book was offered by various entities in the Andromedan councils who attempted to access the Akashic records during the period of 10 million BC to the time of JC. Some of the information is accurate and useful, but the Andromedan entities were able to pierce many of the veils surrounding the Earth during the period detailed in their discourses. Therefore, many of the entities relied on second-hand information given them by various members of the councils of Betelgeuse, Sirius A and Sirius B, who were participants in the Earth experiment during the time periods covered therein. Most of the archangels and ascended masters in the celestial planes had accurate information pertaining to that time period, but were not allowed to disseminate the information due to the policy of non-interference. The energy transmissions of our group, the founders, and several other high-density groups are sufficiently able to pierce the veils, regardless of who or what put them in place. Due to the current dispensation, we are now authorized to reveal this information. The pre-Lemurian period on Earth. The post-Pan pre-Lemurian period corresponds roughly to between 10 million BC and a 500,000 BC. During that time, your world slowly recovered from the Great Flood, and life forms began to proliferate once again. After the destruction of Maldek and the atmosphere of Mars, many of those souls came to Earth and reincarnated, dramatically increasing the population. Earth was once again mainly a tropical jungle with about 90% water cover, and only the polar regions were cool by comparison. As the souls from Maldek and Mars continued coming to Earth, the composite vibratory rate of your world dropped to match their frequency. When the composite awareness level of Earth dropped below upper fourth density, 450 on the calibration scale, souls from neighboring systems were able to access the stargates and portals surrounding Earth, which were not regulated at that time except by the law of attraction. Like attracts like. The composite vibratory state of humanity will tend to attract beings from elsewhere that have a similar vibration. Although the Orions and Dracos already had a foothold on Earth, they came by leaps and bounds once the dominant vibration of human consciousness dropped into lower fourth density. Up until about 500,000 years ago in your timeline, Earth continued to attract more and more souls from across the universe. The vibratory level of these souls was generally fourth density, and that meant they were subject to the astral and etheric distortions inherent within that level of vibration. The genetics of Earth were now a blend of many races, but the Orions gradually began to dominate. War between Rigel and Betelgeuse had made life rather intolerable for many Orions, and Earth was seen as a place to begin life anew. Unlike the Dracos, the Orions were able to easily land directly on the Earth, in addition to coming through the incarnational process, and so their numbers increased significantly faster than the Dracos, whose reptilian bodies had a hard time adjusting to Earth's atmosphere and gravity. We, the founders, observed with dismay what was going on, but because we were not allowed to interfere, we were like lab technicians watching a specimen multiply out of control and doing nothing to contain it. A group of archangels and ascended beings from 7th, 8th, and 9th densities were also watching the Earth. Several of these beings are well known to Earth's people, including Archangel Michael, an ascended being that was later given the name Lucifer, was among those watching the progress of Earth. Lucifer devised a plan to lessen the chaos on Earth by teaching souls how to control their emotions and use their intellectual capabilities so they would not be as easily swayed by the negatively polarized factions. Lucifer mistakenly attributed the decaying situation on Earth to unbridled emotions and passion. A group of souls headed by Lucifer came to Earth and established a series of mystery schools designed to train souls in suppressing and controlling the emotional body. The plan backfired because as the students learned to suppress their emotions, their souls became more and more fragmented until their vibration dropped below 4th density into 3rd density. Suppressing any part of the self results in a loss of power and awareness. The shaming of emotion in men, the Victorian suppression of sexual desire, and the making wrong of feelings all had their origins in Lucifer's philosophy. Archangel Michael, seeing what was happening on Earth, found that he could no longer sit by and simply watch. So he headed a group of ascended beings who voluntarily dropped their vibration and came to Earth, establishing a mystery school designed to raise the vibrations of souls back into the light. Once Michael and his group arrived on Earth, the vibrations were so dense that he and his band of celestial helpers became caught in the game of duality and started seeing the negatively oriented factions as evil forces to be overcome. Thus, these archangels reinforced the concept of light versus dark in your world. Michael took the side of the light, while many members of the councils of Rigel, as well as most of the Dracos, took the polarity of the dark. Meanwhile, Lucifer and his group maintained their cool, calm aloofness, becoming armchair strategists, watching with interest the battles taking shape. Lucifer became so fascinated with this drama of duality that he began building up both sides through training the light and dark forces to fight each other in the interest of seeing who would become supreme victors. The missing ingredients in all of this was compassion. Lucifer taught the soldiers on the battlefield to suppress their emotions and become hardened to misery and suffering. Archangel Michael taught the soldiers to be strong and forceful in overcoming the dark ones. When Lucifer saw what Michael was doing, he turned his attention from the Orions and Dracos and waged war on Michael's forces, most of whom were assisting from the etheric realms. A great battle ensued in the astral and etheric planes above Earth. This became known as the War in the Heavens. Michael's forces were passionate about becoming victors over darkness. Lucifer's forces were cool, calm, and intellectual and waged their wars through cunning strategy. The third force in all of this, the negatively polarized Orions and Dracos, proliferated as their primary foes were now at war with each other. The war in the heavens lasted about 1,000 years, taking place in roughly 500,000 BC. During the period from the 1 million BC until 500,000 BC, the population of Earth had grown from about 200 million to almost a billion people. Because the wars were largely off planet and did not significantly impact the surface of the Earth or the subterranean cultures, the population did not drop that much during the Luciferian rebellion. Most of the surface fighting was regional and involved conventional weapons. After about 1,000 years of fighting, a truce was declared, and Lucifer and his group agreed not to promote overt aggression against anyone in the Earth system. Michael realized the futility of fighting the darkness and also of trying to overcome the suppression of emotional energy by force, and withdrew back into the celestial realms to integrate the lessons learned. Between 500,000 BC and 200,000 BC, life evolved gradually on 3D Earth. A few souls recaptured their fourth density awareness and began learning how to live cooperatively. During this same period, many more souls came from all over the galaxy, and Earth truly became a melting pot. However, the biggest groups were still the Orions from Betelgeuse and Regal. During the Luciferian rebellion, the councils of Betelgeuse sided with Michael and the light forces, while the councils of Regal sided with the dark forces. Although there was very little overt hostility during the transition time following the rebellion, both Orion groups generally confined breeding to their respective polarities, thereby retaining much of their DNA structure. The Betelgeuse factions remained more peaceful, while the Regal factions continued to be domineering and aggressive. The pinnacle of population during these times reached almost 1.5 billion just before a precessional cycle around 200,000 BC severely impacted humanity. It should be noted that the floods, ice ages, tectonic shifting that took place around 200,000 BC buried most of humanity under thousands of feet of rock and debris. Modern-day anthropologists have unearthed remains of some of the people who lived during that time period. This has caused quite a stir among traditional historians who believe human life evolved from apes and that Homo sapiens did not appear until about 30,000 years ago. Authors note the flourishing civilization that existed between 500,000 BC and 200,000 BC has been called Lemuria by some scholars, even though it occurred on several continents. However, the founders have assigned the name Lemuria to two later civilizations, including one occurring from about 200,000 BC to 122,000 BC, and another from about 122,000 BC to 100,000 BC, as described below. Lemuria. The first period of Lemuria started around 200,000 BC, shortly after one of the precessional cycles occurring every 25,920 years took place. This particular shift wiped out over half of Earth's population through massive earthquakes and climate changes. The EM shift caused certain lands to break up and move apart, and one land mass to become particularly fertile ground for the development of a rather benign civilization. Souls who were attracted to this land mass were generally peaceful people, some originating in the Pleiadian sector and some from Sirius and Orion. This continent became roughly the size of Australia and was located almost on the same longitude, but a bit farther north. What most historians do not realize is that civilizations continued on the other continents during this period of Lemuria, even though the vibration of the other continents was not as refined as it was on Lemuria. The Lemurian civilization was later called the Land of Mu. It consisted of nearly 500 million souls at its pinnacle, or about half the total population of Earth at the time. About 3 precessional cycles later, the EM fluctuations were such that another catastrophe ensued, and all the land masses except Lemuria became flooded. Most of the souls who perished in the surrounding continents migrated, reincarnated, onto Lemuria, and the population of Lemuria began to skyrocket. This became the second Lemurian period, roughly from 122,000 BC until about 100,000 BC. At the height of this second Lemurian civilization, the population reached almost 1 billion people. These souls were not technologically oriented, but were tribal in nature, enjoying music and rhythm and living in large cities along the coasts. Around 100,000 BC, the comet Anunnaki made a particularly close approach to Earth, and the tail brushed the atmosphere, causing dramatic cooling. The Lemurian people were used to warm tropical climate, and all of a sudden the temperature dropped about 50 degrees Fahrenheit in only a few hours, freezing most of them. Those who knew what was coming fled to the sea. Many walked into the sea and drowned. A few tried to build undersea cities, but were largely unsuccessful. There are many legends of the sea that originated during this period. The Lemurian landmass eventually sank beneath the sea due to EM storms that followed the passage of the comet. There were only a handful of survivors, and they migrated to what is now India, Indonesia, and Australia, and later Hawaii and the Philippines. On a soul level, the main lesson to be learned from Lemuria was that the emotional self, which was highly developed at the time, needed to be balanced with the intellect, which was missing from the majority of Lemurians. Had the Lemurians developed science, logic, and reasoning skills, they would have had the technology to survive the drop in temperatures. What has not been revealed before, and what has been heavily suppressed on Earth, is that the Alpha Draconians, or Dracos, were behind the unusually close passage of the comet. Through a series of nuclear explosions in space, they deliberately forced the trajectory of the comet closer to Earth in order to destroy the civilizations there. The plan was to wipe out existing life on Earth and then land and claim the Earth for themselves. They were partially successful in this regard, but landing in their native bodies on Earth was a whole lot harder than incarnating into millions of already existing bodies. Suffice to say, they had a hard time surviving in their reptilian bodies due to the unfavorable gravity and mixture of gases in the atmosphere. Their native bodies mutated and grew in size as they adapted. Although their overall numbers remained small, this was the later period that gave rise to the legend of dragons roaming the earth. The Dracos attempted to take over the earth millions of years previously, but were unsuccessful for the same reasons. The Dracos, not to be defeated that easily, spent long years in laboratories aboard their spacecraft, splicing and mutating various DNA samples until they came up with a human/Draco hybrid. The secret involved injecting reptilian DNA into the cerebellum section of the brain, where it quickly mutated the entire system. This part of the human is still called the reptilian brain today. While the characteristics of this part involve aggressive and competitive behavior and the fight or flight syndrome designed to protect the organism, these characteristics, when combined with Orion DNA, become especially potent, dominating virtually the entire organism. Today, about 80% of the DNA in humans is Orion in origin, or maybe we should say Orion-Draco hybrid. What is commonly thought to be human nature is the result of this DNA manipulation by the Dracos and subsequent incarnations by the Orions. As stated in this channel's earlier work, our original Pleiadian DNA blueprint that we were so proud of was eventually reduced to less than 20% of the overall makeup of human beings. Due to the low survival rate of the Dracos after the destruction of Lemuria, the percentage of humans with true reptilian DNA on Earth has remained rather low. Most of the colonization of Earth after 100,000 BC and before Atlantis was done by the Council of Regal and Betelgeuse from Orion. Long after the wars in the Orion constellation came to an end over 100,000 years ago, many of the factions that migrated to Earth continued to stay locked in a battle mentality to the present day. As you can see by looking around your planet, this trait ranges from civilized militarism and fervent patriotism to overt hostility and barbaric customs. In response to various questions from students, we will give a few more details about the Lemurians. There are enormous reports that the Lemurians lived on pure sunlight without the need to eat food. This information is inaccurate. The beings who lived on Lemuria depended heavily on the sea for their food. There were only a few beings in Lemuria who learned how to go without eating, a very, very small number. Perhaps some of you are remembering lifetimes when you were acting as spirit guides to souls embodied there. If so, you did not have a body, in which case you would be correct that you did not need to eat. There is also erroneous information that the Lemurians bred with sea creatures. The Lemurians procreated in the same manner as other human civilizations existing after the ban on interspecies mating. Mermaids were from the time of Pangaea. To summarize regarding Lemuria, it was a civilization that began to organize itself in approximately 200,000 BC and continued until approximately 100,000 BC. It was not a high technology society, it was a tribal society, but the people there became elevated to great levels of artistic achievement. They were what you would call a right brain society, a spontaneous people. They had rituals, they had drumming, musical instruments, dancing, and the arts were very much an essential focus. They were generally a peaceful and loving people, but they were naive in many ways and did not see the warning signs of what was going to happen to their civilization. A group of beings from the sectors of Orion and Draco invaded the Lemurian society and contributed to its destruction. They, in effect, kept the Lemurians from evolving more rapidly and possibly being able to prevent their demise. Then along came the comet's tail, which greatly dropped the temperature of Lemuria, causing most of the inhabitants to freeze. During the Lemurian civilization, human beings were still at what you call third and fourth densities. In some cases, they were being guided by spirits from fifth, sixth, and seventh densities, and many of these spirits taught them a great deal. However, the veils around Earth prevented most of them from achieving true enlightenment. Lemuria was destroyed partly out of the ignorance of the people and partly out of manipulation by what you call dark forces. Had the Lemurian people been balanced within, they never would have attracted unbalanced forces from outside themselves. Inner Earth civilizations. There are a number of reasons why souls moved underground, the most obvious of which is the fact that there were many periods upon the surface of Earth where habitation became impossible or nearly impossible. After Pan and Lemuria, 3 major subterranean cities were established in the fourth density planes: Telos, Shambhala, and Poseidon. The inner Earth vibration is very similar to that of the fairy realms, and there are a lot of similarities between the etheric inner Earth and the fairy worlds. Inner Earth civilizations still exist in subterranean parts of your world to this day. They are not vibrating at a dense physical level, but just above it in the higher fourth density and lower fifth density frequencies. And so most of the civilizations will not be apparent to any of your scientists who try to dig them up. Even if they could reach that far into the subterranean chambers, there are meditative exercises you can do that will take you into one of those subterranean cities. We will have more to say about these civilizations at a later date. Let us say a few words about the veils and levels of distortion existing above your world during the time of transition from Lemuria to Atlantis. Both the Alpha Draconians and Orions had fleets of ships orbiting the Earth during this period. These ships were largely in fourth density. The two groups had a loose alliance based on trading of technology in exchange for keeping hostilities at bay. One of the technologies they had developed was a high-intensity electromagnetic beam capable of disrupting the etheric fields around Earth. In order to keep their enemies from coming to Earth, they created a force field using this technology. This field did not only keep incoming ET groups at bay, but it created a further distortion in the Akashic fields surrounding the Earth. Although the main library of Akasha does not have a location in time and space, this area above Earth's atmosphere constituted a portal into the Akashic. This is one of the reasons retrieving information from this time period has been so difficult for your clairvoyance. Another important factor to consider here, and one that has been written about in many of your books, is the quarantine that went into effect after the destruction of Lemuria. Because the vibratory levels of humans had dropped significantly since the early days of colonization, Earth was no longer considered a safe and desirable place upon which to settle peaceful, loving groups. To prevent the Orions and Dracos from corrupting the astral and etheric civilizations on neighboring worlds, a force field was put into place by the 7th density Pleiadians to keep Earth's business confined to Earth. This veil was not lifted until approximately 1987. During the time known as harmonic convergence, despite the quarantine, the problems of Earth continued. Once Earth's instability settled down after the destruction of Lemuria, the Dracos once again landed and attempted to proliferate, but had a hard time in their reptilian bodies. They then resorted to incarnating through the surviving Lemurians on a relatively stable landmass in what is now the Atlantic Ocean. At the same time, groups of Pleiadians saw the opportunity to once again settle the Earth, and they came as well, despite the quarantine. The councils of Regal and Betelgeuse from Orion also returned, and they found the atmosphere of Earth still ideal for rapid proliferation. They were also